Magnus Carlsen has been crowned world champion for an incredible 5th time in a row, and that now makes him world champion since 2013. He beat Ian Nepomniachtchi today in another incredible display of clinical chess, and so let's see what happened here. Ian had the white pieces and he kicked off with e4. He didn't go for c4 today, the English which we saw last time he had white. Magnus goes e5, we had knight f3, knight c6, and now Ian goes for bishop c4, the so-called Italian game, not going in for bishop b5, the Spanish game which we've seen so much in this match. We had knight f6 from Magnus, pawn to d3 now, and bishop c5 from Magnus, a very common move, bringing the bishop outside the pawn chain. We had c3 from Ian, a common pawn push, preparing d4 later. We had d6 now from Magnus, castles from Ian, pawn to a5. You could have gone pawn to a6 here, or even h6, or castles. There's lots of flexible ways for black to play here. Rook e1 now from Ian, very standard, and Magnus just tucks his bishop away back on a7, preempting a later d4 break. And we had knight to a3 now from Ian, so it looks a bit weird putting your knight on the edge of the board like this, but it is coming back to the centre where it then supports the bishop coming to e3. Another way to do this would be knight to d2 and then to f1, but Ian chooses to play like this. We had h6 now from Magnus, just taking this square away. We had knight to c2 now from Ian, castles from Magnus, and now bishop to e3. So Magnus is happy to swap off those pieces, the knight recaptures, and now we had rook to e8, another very standard developing move. Pawn to a4 now from Ian, good move, claiming space on the queen side, controlling b5 a little more. Bishop to e6 now, very logical, challenging this strong piece, and arguably Ian could have looked to play bishop b5 here, keep some tension in the position, but he actually swapped these pieces off. Magnus recaptures and Ian goes queen to b3. So by chopping those bishops, he's cleared the way for the queen to put some pressure here, but Magnus is actually quite comfortable to just go pawn to b6 and defend in that manner. And although you weaken the c6 square, we know that this knight will likely be remanoeuvring, so it's not such a big deal. We now had rook a to d1, so Ian brings that firepower to the centre, never a bad thing to look at the opponent's queen, and he prepares d4 in future. We had knight to e7 now from Magnus, and pawn to h3. Now the queen slides up to d7, just a steady developing move, preparing to bring the rook across, and this is where Ian now has to find a plan. So he wants to play d4 at some point, but you can't do it here immediately, because after pawn captures, let's say pawn recaptures, then you're losing this e4 pawn here. So he can't go with that immediate break, and so he's forced to play something a little slower, such as maybe queen to b5 was one option, maybe queen to c2, but it looks a bit slow. Instead he played knight h2, and this was part of the h3 move, and we'll see what he's intending here. So after rook to d8 from Magnus, now he goes knight into g4. And after these knights come off like this, and the pawn recaptures, we can see that although Ian has doubled his pawns here, he's trying to potentially use this g-pawn as an aggressive lever in the future. But the problem with this manoeuvre is it now gives Magnus time to break in the centre. So Magnus is first to the punch with pawn to d5 here. A good move, striking out while the opportunity presents itself. You don't really want to take as white, because after the knight recaptures, you're just not really getting anywhere. Pretty much your best is just going to be swapping off pieces here, and you've got no advantage to speak of. So that's why instead of capturing there, Ian instead threw forward a counter punch with pawn to d4. And there's a lot of tension in the centre here now, but Magnus navigates his way through this really nicely. So one of the key things to recognise here as black when thinking about how to play is that you don't really want to open this d file in an unfavourable way, because then the rook will be staring straight down at your queen. So that's why a capture such as takes on e4 wouldn't be good, because then you can take here as white and you're picking up tempo on the queen. Say the queen drops back, well, now we can jump in with queen to c4. You're hitting this pawn, you're hitting this pawn, and if the rook captures this one, well, then you can take this one. So coming back here, that's why Magnus doesn't open the e-file, and he doesn't play a passing move like, say, knight to g6, which would then allow white to open the d-file. Instead, he captures here, keeping that file as closed as possible right now. And Jan then captures here. Now he could have played rook to d4, that was another alternative he had, but then Magnus would be going rook takes on e4. And the problem for Jan with these kind of lines, say we had something like this, is it's just very hard to find any advantage, and he was really trying to shake it up as much as possible as he could at this stage. So instead of taking there, he took here, and now Magnus found a really nice response here. He just played rook to e4, bolstering that pawn in the centre. And again, the problem for white is it's just so hard to complicate now and prove any advantage. Probably the best is just taking this pawn here, and after the rooks come off like this, black can play something like knight takes on d5 or even g6 first before recapturing that pawn, and white just has very little to speak of. So Jan was desperately trying to mix it up here, and that's why after rook to e4 we had queen c2 hitting that rook to f4 from Magnus, and now pawn to g3 from Jan. An atrocious move trying to mix it up here. He should just accept that he has to take this pawn with his rook. And Magnus now pounces on this blunder with pawn takes knight here, because after the pawn takes the rook, the queen jumps in with check. And so whilst black has given up a rook here, in compensation there's a knight and a pawn, plus a massive attack now against the white king. So the king side steps across, Magnus gives this check here. Now you don't want to come into e2, or you're really just running into a lot of danger in the centre. You can take this pawn as black, and the king can't recapture, or we come in here with this skewer and pick up the white queen. And so that's why coming back here, after this check was thrown in, Jan went king to g1, and now Magnus actually had a really simple winning manoeuvre, but he just missed it in the pressure of the moment. He could have simply taken here. Again, the king can't take, or you pick up the queen with the skewer, and after the queen recaptures, well, now you simply go rook to d6, and this rook is swinging to g6 with decisive effect here. There's nothing that white can do to avoid the checkmate other than give up the white queen, but Magnus actually missed the play like this. Instead, in this position, he played knight to f5, still a good move, but losing some of his advantage. So Jan now pushed on with pawn to d6, he's trying to shake it up through the middle, and Magnus just responds in quite a calm way now. So he could look to capture this pawn here with c takes or even rook takes, but he's trying to just keep a lid on Jan's counterplay. So instead he plays knight h4, creating a threat of his own, which is checkmate in 1. This does allow white to recapture this pawn here, so now the queen laterally defends that checkmate. But this now gives Magnus time to go queen g3 check. We have king f1 here, and now knight to f3, hitting this rook on e1. Jan is basically forced to slide the queen across here. If he tries to save the rook with, say, rook to e1, then we have checkmate in 1. And if he takes here, attacking this rook, we have very similar checkmating ideas, with queen to g1, king to e2, and this is actually now checkmate because of the open d file for the black rook. So coming back here, Jan can't save that rook. Instead he brings the queen across, and now Magnus throws in a check on h3, and Jan has a choice of what endgame he wants to go in for. In the game he blocked with the queen. If he tries to run away with the king, well, now we can take on e1. You can take this back in a few ways, but let's say king recaptures. The rook can take here, rook recaptures, pawn takes, and although white is only a pawn down, this queen endgame is completely lost, mainly because black has this outside h pawn which is just running down the board and it's too much for the pieces to cope with. So Jan goes queen to g2 here, the queens get traded off, and now that knight chops the rook on e1. Rook recaptures, and Magnus takes this pawn here. So he's simplified down into an endgame where he's a pawn up, but this is just completely lost at this point, because after king f3 we have rook to d2, and you can't defend like this, or black can just take, and after the king recaptures, this h pawn is just going to be storming down the board with decisive effect. So coming back here, that's why Jan has to go rook to b1. Now we had pawn to g6 from Magnus, a nice tidy move, just preparing to bring the king up. We had pawn to b4 now from Jan, so his only hope here is that he can trade these three for these three, but in practice there just isn't the time for this. So Magnus captures here, you can't take back with the pawn, or the rook comes to a2 and you're picking up this one. So that's why Jan recaptures with the rook, and now a really tidy move from Magnus, he goes rook to a2, and the whole point of this is that if white now goes rook to c4, you can play c5 to defend now, and there's no longer the a5 move. If this rook wasn't here, white would have had a5 now, and after recaptures, you pick up this one, and the point is that these pawns might get exchanged for each other now, and then you're left with a 2-1-3 on the king side, which is way more drawable for white than the other position. So coming back here, that's why we had rook a2. Instead of rook c4, Jan tried king to e4, just trying to rush in and pick up these pawns. We now had pawn to h5 from Magnus, so he gets that pawn going. King to d5 now, and rook to c2 here. He could have already pushed h4 even, Magnus, but he goes for this line. Again, a very forcing way to continue, which he's calculated is winning. We had rook to b3 now defending that pawn. Now we had pawn to h4, king to c6, pawn to h3, king takes on c7, pawn to h2, and now rook to b1 to stop that pawn. But here's what Magnus has calculated. He now takes on c3 with check. White takes here, which is basically the only sensible move, and now Magnus has this nice check, hitting king and rook here, and white is forced to capture, which allows Magnus to queen now. And although white has this a pawn which he gets going, the problem is white just can't coordinate these pieces in time. So queen e4 from Magnus, a really nice centralizing move. And the problem for white is the rook and king are just way too loose. So if you push a6 here, then queen e6 immediately wins the game on the spot. You pick up the rook. That's why Jan tried king to a7 instead. But now Magnus just goes queen to e7 check. The king moves away, and now king to g7. A really nice move, just emphasising the hopelessness of white's position, because if you push a6 now, you can just go queen e6, you're hitting the pawn and the rook, and if the rook tries to defend, well, now you go check, king a7, queen e7 check, and you're picking up this rook, and so this is the problem, white just can't coordinate. So instead Jan plays the rook into b6, but now once again Magnus has it covered, queen to c5. You can't push the pawn or the rook drops. If you try and defend the pawn, well, now we just pick up here, and this is going nowhere with two pieces in front, so white can literally do nothing here, and black's just going to pick these ones up and then push the g-pawn down. So after queen c5, Jan actually resigned, and Magnus was crowned champion. If you've enjoyed this series, then do click here to subscribe and never miss another video, and see another amazing game, click here. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.